Rabobank, New Zealand's only specialist food and agri bank. A bank working together with farmers for farmers. Our commitment to our rural clients and their communities runs deep. Today, New Zealanders save with Rabobank and their savings stay in New Zealand to support Kiwi farmers and food producers. These savings are supporting strong, successful, sustainable rural businesses, and they're helping New Zealand. Savers and borrowers, town and country, all coming together. Together is how we can make a difference.
G'day New Zealand and welcome to the Rabobank Fieldays Online panel discussion. I'm Jamie Mackay, your host. Normally over the Fieldays period, this takes the form of a breakfast on the Thursday morning. Always a real highlight of field days. Obviously that can't happen or didn't happen this year, but with field days going online, we thought we would move our panel discussion online and allow not only 200 invited clients, but the rest of the country to get some first-hand expert advice from our panel of experts. So let's introduce them. Rightio, we are going to be kicking it off with Michael Every, a global strategist who's based, hello Michael, based out of Israel, and I'm not quite sure what's on your chin there, but you certainly look different to last time I saw you. In fact, I'm a bit worried about this Rabobank beard thing, but Michael's one of the most popular correspondents we have on the country. Some might call him an alarmist, some might call him a realist. So we're going to talk to him about COVID. We are going to follow that up with Tim Hunt. Tim and I go a long way back. We were lucky enough to share a road. Hello, Tim. We were lucky enough to share a roadshow after the 2015 Rugby World Cup. Remember, Tim, that's the one we won. And I enjoyed your company in the Waikato and Christchurch. And our third panel member is Blake Holgate, based out of Dunedin here. Blake is Rabobank's animal protein and sustainability analyst, and we're going to talk about the sheep and beef industry, swine fever, and the general position in New Zealand ag. And right at the end, we've got the bloke who's paying for all this. He's the chief executive, Todd Charteris, a good southern man as well. G'day, Todd.
Hey,
and
Jamie.
Todd's going to give an executive summary. Now, we've taken some of your questions that you've sent in and we've made some up ourselves, and David Johnson, the most organised man at Rabobank, has sent us some. So let's kick off our panel discussion with our first panellist, Michael Every, based out of Israel, a global strategist. As I said, Michael, some people call you an alarmist, some people might call you a realist, some people even cruelly on occasion, such as myself, have called you a grim reaper. You're anything but I am impressed by that beard. Is that a lockdown beard?
It is a lockdown beard. It actually started prior to this current lockdown when I left Hong Kong around September last year. It was a kind of a protest beard, but it's currently a lockdown beard, yeah, and I think it's going to get a wee bit longer yet.
I think so. Well, let's look at COVID and how it's affecting the world. It's obviously going to get worse before it gets better.
Definitely. Whatever measure you look at it on, things are going to get much, much worse. Now, I have to stress to everyone watching immediately, I'm not a virologist. A lot of people would point out I'm also no longer an economist, I'm a strategist, which is also true. But you don't have to be too much of an expert to look at the current trends and turn around and say that they're very, very bad. The only good piece of news, apart from the fact that New Zealand seems to be doing okay, is that overnight we've had news that one potential vaccine, amongst many that have been developed, appears to show some promise. But of course, any company developing them always is going to say that because it guarantees your share price goes through the roof and everyone places orders. You're never going to come out and say it isn't looking very good because you drop out of the race. So that's the only good bit of news we've got, because let me be blunt, the nuts and bolts of this are, we don't get a virus, we don't go back to normal. Talk about, maybe in a few months from now, things will be better. Maybe early next year, things will be better. They're never going to be better. They're never going to return to what life used to be like if we don't have some health guarantee that everyone can experience what New Zealand is currently experiencing, which is we've put this behind us and we can now look around us and say, whew, that was a bit nasty. And we are nowhere near that. Country after country is getting worse and worse. Most of them aren't even in control. And what we've seen here in Israel specifically is that you can break the back of the virus with a lockdown. You can really get those numbers right down to single digits And as soon as you open up the economy again and say, go out, have a beer, go to a restaurant, relax, meet your family, have a wedding, virus comes roaring straight back again. So you have to get rid of 100% of the cases, or you haven't got rid of it at all.
So how many countries around the world, including New Zealand, are in this very special position of maybe being able to eliminate it? I'm assuming you can count them on one hand?
Yeah, I think we're talking about New Zealand and Taiwan, maybe Vietnam. So potentially 3. That's about all I can think of off the top of my head. Now, maybe I'm overlooking someone. There might be Micronesia. Actually, I think Micronesia is not doing very well. But in terms of, major economies, you're talking about 3. So any hope that you're going to be getting air bridges, for tourism emerging anytime soon, they're going to be very, very narrow bridges with a very, very limited number of destinations, the way it looks at the moment. And of course, this is going to be shifting all the time as countries that looked like they were doing okay, like Australia, suddenly see cases roaring back again, and everyone realizes that, it only takes one sick person to start that 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64 doubling process kicking off again. And the whole thing's roaring back.
All right, talk to me about China, our most important market. That's where it started, if you're to believe Donald Trump anyhow. They seem to be on top of it to a degree. How important is that to us, bearing in mind, as I said, they're our biggest market?
Well, here we have to pivot, because I've had a lot of negative things about China to say over the years, as I'm sure viewers are aware. And I have to say, I rather feel like wearing an I told you so t-shirt, not just because I said this year was going to be a stinker, but because I don't think there's a positive story about China out there in the press on any front whatsoever, apart from the fact that you could say maybe they've managed to beat the virus, although even there it keeps coming back in places. Even if they have beat the virus, which is questionable, everyone else is beating them with a big stick in terms of the global geopolitical environment. China is not exactly seen as a warm, friendly trading partner at the moment. Quite the opposite. You're seeing country after country walking away and slamming the door behind them. So were New Zealand to turn around and say, okay, we think you've beaten it, we've beaten it, here's a fantastic opportunity for us to deepen trade relations with you even further than we already have, I think there are, and I'm not exaggerating here, existential political choices that are being made in that particular decision, if you choose to go that route at a time when everyone else, including Australia, is walking away at speed. So it's not just about the virus and about getting business back to normal. It's understanding that the world has changed and it isn't going to be going back to how it was.
Michael, what about the fact that the world needs to eat and New Zealand's always going to be okay because we're a net exporter of food?
Well, I don't disagree with that. Absolutely. I've never had a negative thing to say about that particular prognosis. And I'm sure the other Rabo experts speaking shortly will have much more in depth to say about that. What I've continued to stress for years now, so I'm not surprised by what's happening this particular year, is that it's not as simple as that. Of course it is if you're a farmer and you're looking for a market, but we operate in an environment in which politics matters. Choices about who you're selling to matter. For those of you who've got a long enough memory, during the Cold War, the first Cold War with the Soviet Union, we didn't sell anything to the Soviet Union. The US occasionally sold them some wheat when they were starving. And we did it because we didn't agree with how they ran their economy and how they looked after their own population in terms of human rights. We could have made a lot of money selling to them. They didn't want to buy from us to a large degree, and we refused to sell to them to a large degree. Even after the end of the Cold War, of course, for a few years overlapping, people wouldn't do business with South Africa. Yeah, you can make a lot of money selling to them. People just said you shouldn't do it because we don't agree with their system. That is the start of the process that we're seeing underway now with China. Now, of course, there are still lots of areas where even China hawks are saying, well, yeah, we do still want to sell to them. But they're starting to say we only want to sell to them provided everything is reciprocal. My market's open, your market's open. It's got to be absolutely reciprocal on all fronts. So if New Zealand doesn't want to do that because you're a massive food net exporter and China is a massive buyer of food, that makes sense for you two bilaterally. No one can dispute that. But what I keep trying to hammer home is if you think you can get away with doing that just because it suits you and the whole rest of the world is saying it doesn't suit us, you're going to be walking a very, very lonely path that ends up with Chinese being taught as the major language in New Zealand schools. That's basically the future you're looking at.
Well, perhaps a final question for you. You mentioned a Cold War or going back to the Cold War. Do you think we're heading into another one?
Oh, we're deep in it already. Absolutely. In fact, just overnight, just to bring the listeners up to date, Donald Trump has signed a new piece of legislation, which has been pending for some time, which is called the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. And that states that we now have a maximum of 6 months, 150 days, during which the US will assess who in China it views as responsible for crushing Hong Kong's autonomy. That's what the legislation specifically does. And it will put sanctions on them. And then 1 year after that date, so 18 months from now, any bank that does business with those individuals suffers US sanctions. Now, they're pretty biting, but they're not absolutely the most ferocious set. But another year after that, so 2.5 years from now, which seems a long, long way away, but time passes pretty quickly. 2.5 years from now, every bank that does business with these individuals, which could include the head of the Hong Kong government, for example, or even people in China itself, they will not be able to use the US dollar. So they're completely cut out of the global financial system. So what's happened overnight is the US has started a countdown clock on the largest Chinese banks, including the Bank of China, I would imagine, and all the banks that were absolutely fundamental to the Chinese system, which every New Zealand farmer selling to is dealing with one step removed when they're exporting to them, will not be able to use US dollars. And if so, everything you're selling, you're not going to get paid in US dollars.
Michael, sorry for interrupting. We do need to move on, but I guess the only saving grace in that department is the US has got an election at the end of the year, and hopefully the people see common sense. That's my comments, not yours. Michael Every out of Israel, thank you very much for taking some time to chat to us today on the Rabobank Fieldays Online panel. We're going to go from Israel to Australia next. Tim Hunt is the head of Food and Agri-Research, Australia and New Zealand for Rabobank. And Michael's always very challenging, Michael Every, always very challenging. But Tim Hunt, can you be a wee bit more upbeat? Give me a reason to live.
Well, I think we do have a reason to live, and in particular New Zealand farmers do. There's no doubting the economic damage this virus is doing. That is having an impact on consumption of the products we produce. There's no question about that. But there are a couple of really important offsets. One is the same virus causing the demand side problems is actually disrupting supply in some of our competing markets. And the other is we have things like swine fever underpinning huge demand from animal protein out of China. And the final one is New Zealand has managed to keep its production process and supply chains open and running, which has placed it really well to capitalise on the demand that is still out there for the products it produces.
What's your take on China?
Depends on the complex we're talking about, Jamie. In terms of the demand side, the food service really has been whacked hard. Food service sales of food were down about half for several months. And still about 6 months into this crisis in China, we still see food service sales down about 20% on where they were in the prior year, if we take May numbers. So if you're selling rock lobsters into a restaurant or high-end lamb cuts, racks into a Chinese restaurant, that's a tough place to be. But retail has been a much better market with sort of double-digit increase in sales in China. And if you're selling something they're short of, which includes general mutton products, lamb and beef, due to swine fever, it's been a really good market for New Zealand so far this year.
Is food and agriculture the best business to be in a post-COVID world?
It is in New Zealand because you've kept this virus under control and the supply chains open. If we ask the same question to someone who produces or processes beef in the US, then they'd say it's a really tough industry to be in with COVID around, as it impacts the infection rates, shut down your processing capacity. You can't get your livestock processed. You might have to euthanize it. Even if you don't, the price falls. So coming through COVID, it's been a very good spot for New Zealand to be, but food and ag's been tough in other markets.
Tell me why last week the global dairy trade auction went up something like 8%, whole milk powder, 13 or 14%? What was behind that?
very difficult to understand the magnitude of the increase, Jamie. I don't think you'd find anyone who said otherwise. The shorter term factors we're seeing is Fonterra has reduced volume somewhat that it's putting on the auction. And we've also seen, as lockdowns have eased in some countries in the last few weeks, food service companies starting to refill their pipelines full of milk powders, butters and cheeses and so forth. So a temporary demand call, some reduction in volumes on the auction, but we think that the magnitude of the increase is difficult to explain. Not dismissing, though, the fact that this market has performed better over the last month than we thought it would.
So you're across the ditch. Correct me if I'm wrong, you're located in Melbourne. Did I get that right?
Correct. We've gone from near lockdown Israel to lockdown Melbourne. No longer the world's most livable city, Jamie.
How bad is it to go back into lockdown for 6 weeks, and what effect is that going to have on Victoria as opposed to the rest of Australia? And I ask with some interest because I have a daughter and son-in-law based in Adelaide. He's got a swimming pool business. He's been running around. It's just been life as normal for them.
Yeah, it's going to be tough at personal level for the mental health of a lot of people who live in the smaller apartments with larger families and homeschooling, which is a bit of a tough gig for those who've been through it, even with the best of kids. Business-wise, it's going to be extremely difficult for the food service sector, for the entertainment sector, for the travel sector, and there are going to be flow-on impacts. The income damage is mounting. That means less money to spend on things that aren't shut down, including basic retail household items. So it's emotionally difficult to go back to. It's going to really stress the sectors that have been under pressure already and had a glimpse of opening up again. And that is going to impact some farmers in this part of the world who are selling micro herbs into fine-end restaurants, who are putting seafood on the tables of the restaurants, or the premium wines that we see through these channels. So it's something we don't want many of our markets to go through, which is why New Zealand really has to watch closely things like Beijing lockdowns, Leicester City lockdowns, California shutting down overnight food service again. So let's hope Melbourne's one of the few that really has to go back into this, because there are flow-on impacts for New Zealand farmers in certain sectors.
So in summary, Tim Hunt, New Zealand is the lucky country.
New Zealand is the lucky country through this, although it has to take some credit for managing this virus and being relatively agile. It's not easy as a food industry to pivot from retail to food service, to keep your markets open. And I think that if there's one thing, and there are several that New Zealand may benefit from in the long term from this, it's that offshore buyers are going to remember when the chips were down and it was really difficult to get food into their markets, who kept the supply chains open? New Zealand. And that's going to stand this country, New Zealand, in good stead for years to come as we come out of this crisis.
Tim Hunt, out of Australia, Melbourne, Australia. Good luck with the lockdown. Thanks for some of your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jamie.
Panelist number 3 on our Rabobank Fieldays Online panel discussion is Blake Holgate, based right out of Dunedin, where the country's based. Right, he's an animal proteins and sustainability analyst. And Blake, I want to continue on with the COVID theme. And then have a look at African swine fever. So how's the red meat industry fared through COVID?
Well, in lots of ways, Jamie, I think the New Zealand red meat industry has performed relatively well. Now, prices are down from what we would otherwise expect. But if you look at our average export earnings for both sheep and beef through those sort of critical March, April, May months, they were actually up year on year compared to the previous month. So, domestically we had some challenges around processing, got on top of that. In key markets we had some really major disruptions into China initially, but were able to supply some of our other major markets. As the rest of the world got sick and some of those other major markets started to be impacted, a lot of that flowed back to China. So today, in lots of ways, things have held up relatively well. Now, when we look forward, some of those, what we call those downside risks, so what we think could impact pricing over the next 6 months, over the next year, are starting to increase. So we've seen a rising New Zealand dollar over the last month. We've seen a re-outbreak in Beijing in China, and obviously China's a very important market for us. And as countries try and come out of lockdown, we've seen, as Michael alluded to earlier, it's really hard. So either they're going to have to go much slower and the impact on food service lasts longer, or even going back into lockdown. So all that flows through onto, downside demand risk for New Zealand red meat.
One man's misfortune is another man's good fortune, and we shouldn't count our blessings in this way, but how lucky are we that African swine fever has taken hold around quite a part of the world?
Yeah, this remains the big tick in the New Zealand red meat farmers column. This is going a long way to offset some of those other negative international market drivers. So we've talked about it previously on your show, but African swine fever continues to severely disrupt pork production in a number of key regions, but China's the one we're most interested in. It took a massive hit on their production last year. We're expecting their pork production this year to be down sort of another 15 to 20%. So in terms of our viewers, that's around 8 to 10 million tonnes of pork that won't be produced on already low numbers last year. For some context, New Zealand produces roughly 1 million tonnes of red meat a year. So that continues to produce a huge protein gap in China that they need to turn to the export markets to fill. And that's, that benefits New Zealand. But it also means other protein producers across the globe, whether they're producing poultry, pork, seafood, beef or sheep meat, we're also directing their product into China, removing competition in some of our other key markets. So that is, and will continue to be over the next 12 months, a major offset to some of those COVID-related disruptions we're seeing.
Are all proteins effectively benefiting from African swine fever?
Essentially, yes, Jamie. Yep. So some are benefiting more. So you look at poultry as a cheaper cost or value protein. That's more substitutional with pork. So that's sort of seeing the immediate effect. But ultimately, the gap or hole in China's protein is so significant that they essentially need all forms of protein that they can get to fill that gap. The other thing that we have seen is with pork and some of those other lower value proteins, the retail price in China has actually significantly increased due to scarcity, which has meant the gap between the lower value proteins like pork and the higher value proteins like beef has become much reduced. So consumers are going into the supermarket and going, well, I'm going to try a cut of beef because normally it might be double the price. Now we're only talking sort of 10%. So that has enticed a lot more consumers to come across to the higher value proteins.
Final question for you, Blake. Has COVID, or putting on your sustainability hat, has COVID effectively gifted or offered New Zealand an opportunity here?
Look, I think it has, in terms of how we can position ourselves post-COVID. So I think, undoubtedly we've all come under some price pressure through COVID and the associated economic downturn. As we come out of this, I think New Zealand's in a prime position to hold itself out, as Tim alluded to earlier, as a reliable source of food. On top of that, consumers will be looking for healthy and safe food. Now both of these aspects that consumers already value highly from New Zealand, given our extensive pasture-based systems. On top of that, if we put the factor that touch wood, we've managed to contain and hopefully eliminate COVID from our shores, that will play really strongly in the minds of consumers when they think about the health values. On top of that, we put the strong sustainability attributes, and we build a really strong provenance around the food that we're producing. That I do think we will be able to leverage and realise value from post this COVID situation.
Blake Holgate, Animal Protein and Sustainability Analyst. Thanks for your time on today's Rabobank Fieldays Online panel.
Thanks, Jamie.
So, wrapping our Rabobank Fieldays Online panel discussion is Rabobank New Zealand's Chief Executive, Todd Charteris. Good Southern man. and he's paying the bills, so we thought we'd better give him a say at the end there. Hey, Todd, you're going to do a wee executive summary, but I've got a question to throw at you, and it's something that Michael Every mentioned to us before we went to air, and this is about a reset. And this is how townies view country folk in terms of a social licence to farm. And my view anyhow, and I'd be interested in yours, is that I think urban New Zealand sees farmers in an improved and a much better light. They have seen us, or seen the farming community, as potential economic saviours, and I think there's more respect for rural New Zealand. What do you reckon?
No, I think you're right, and I think it's absolutely real, and it's really big from a food and agri perspective, and from a farmer perspective. If you have a look at that, and we've seen it. It came out recently in the report produced last week. The 10-year outlook in terms of from an economic recovery, that food and agri is going to be a absolute driving contributor to that. And we've also seen it come through actually in one of the measures that our farmers gives them reason in our rural confidence survey, that one of the reasons for optimism is just that they're feeling better about what they're doing, and that's coming through the communities in which they live in. So it's great.
I love Michael Every. He's one of the most popular Rabobank correspondents I have, obviously behind Tim and Blake. He's not online anymore, Michael, but he is kind of alarmist. And then I enjoyed Tim and Blake's optimism to a degree anyhow. Where do you sit on the optimism-pessimism scale? If it's a doomsday clock, surely we're not 1 minute from midnight.
No, look, I think, what I took from Michael was, the virus has got a long way to go, right? And it's going to be a slow recovery from an economic perspective until we, come out of the other side, whatever that looks like by the time we get there. So it's going to be a slow recovery. But also what I certainly took from both Tim and Blake is, being in food production, producing high quality, safe and sustainable food like our New Zealand farmers do is a really good position to be in. So I think, on the balance, I think we're in a really good position. But there's global uncertainty out there. We're an exporter. The uncertainty in these global markets is real, and we need to have a balanced view and understand the volatility that will exist in those global markets.
I think that something that came through from Michael, from Tim, and to a lesser degree Blake, because he's based here in New Zealand, is just how well positioned we are as a country to get through this. No one's going to get through unscathed, but if you had to pick anywhere to be in the world, I reckon you'd pick New Zealand.
Yeah, no, I think we should feel like the lucky country right now, absolutely. And I think, we don't have to look too far. And it was, interesting to hear Tim's perspective. He's based in Melbourne and what that community is going through over there. And so for us, we are in a good position. We need to make every post a winner, so to speak, but we're well placed. And I think the ability of our farmers and our producers and our processing companies to maintain those supply chains throughout this to date has been nothing less than staggering, really, and really impressive. And that's what gives us confidence, I think, as we can lean into this.
Well, Todd Charteris, Chief Executive of Rabobank, thanks for facilitating this panel. Thank you, Tim Hunt, who's listening in Australia, Blake in Dunedin. Michael Every has gone offline from Israel. But Todd, when we're putting together our breakfast panel, even though I think this will be a regular annual feature as well, but when we're putting together our breakfast panel for Field Days next year, we've got to include Michael Every.
We'll have to get him back.
That beard off.
Yeah, hopefully he's had a shave by then. But look, no, thanks. And also I'd just like to take the opportunity, Jamie, to thank you for pulling this together. You've done this with us for a number of years in a more physical sense up in Mystery Creek. So thanks for your help with us, and thanks to the guys on the call also. So enjoy the Field Days, everyone.
Michael Every, Tim Hunt, Blake Holgate, Todd Charteris, thank you for being Rabobank's Field Days Online Rural panel today.